Guten Abend, meine Lieben. Also wieder für eine Stunde das Vergnügen haben, etwas philosophisch zu sprechen. Und dabei handelt es sich um eine ganz besondere Frau. Eine Frau, die eigentlich nicht klassifiziert werden kann, nämlich Hannah Arendt. Unglaublich, was für eine Literatur sie verursacht hat. Und noch heute werden are lots of people sort of publishing almost every day. And so to have a class on her is really quite an audacious undertaking. So first, I would like to tell you a little bit about her life for those of you who, for the first time, really hear of her. She was born 1906 in Hanover, and then was brought up in Königsberg. As a student, she went to the University of Marburg, where she got to know Heidegger. Heidegger remained a lifelong influence on her, although she was no Heideggerian at all. Then she wrote a doctorate thesis on here was a Jewish woman. Imagine that, who wrote a doctoral thesis with a Protestant professor about a Catholic bishop of North Africa with on the concept, imagine that, of love. That's it. And astoundingly enough, that particular work, Love and Saint Augustine, has remained an ongoing dimension in her life, which I will try to show during our discussion. All right. But afterwards, she she wrote that dissertation, and very soon afterwards, she did it in 1929. 1933, Hitler came to power. She had to flee. She went to France. She was occupying a number of camps in France until the invasion of the Germans in France in 1940. She had to flee in the company of Benjamin down to the pyramids and through, and while Benjamin was dying there, actually, she found a way through the Pyrenees and Portugal to escape to the United States. As soon as she arrived in the United States, she started working as a writer and editor and all of these things. And within, I would say, 5-6 years, she was already sufficiently known in the United States, and came out with a book which is still heavily discussed, which about the origins of totalitarianism. Then she went on to write a basic book, which is really the basic book that we are discussing tonight, about the human condition. And about 12 years later, she came out with a book on Eichmann. All of these things we should address today at least, and maybe postpone other things to next week. But we have a lot of work to do today. And she died abruptly in 1975 from a heart attack in the middle of doing work on a book that she called The Life of the Mind. Now, one thing is sure, and I want to point that out to you right from the beginning, the impossibility of classifying that woman. Here is it's a shocking news. For instance, she really rejected subjectivity. She rejected psychology. She rejected introspection. She rejected all sorts of things, including psychoanalysis, because she thought all of that were really futile enterprises. What counted for her was the public space of political action. and we have to examine that. But she was an original thinker. When she left two expressions that we have to study today. One was, I'm thinking without a banister, which is so true. She said that 3-4 years before she died, when she was asked, how do you classify yourself? I mean, who is really your major influence? She refused, really, any influence and said, I'm thinking without a banister, nothing. I am myself. And the other expression that we need to examine more closely is the banality of evil. To call evil banal, what the hell is going on here? I mean, this is something that is extremely serious, and we will have to take that under our observation. But she was asked also about 10 years before she died about her affiliation. She said she was obviously not a liberal. She said she was not a conservative. She said she really wasn't identifiable. Although she had sympathies for the left, she really didn't identify with the left, let alone, of course, not identifying with the right. But she identified what she called the world. That's huge. In other words, she really didn't recognize to have a place on this globe except in human affairs. And that's what she meant by the world. That was her home. And although she had the American citizenship, 1951, later on the Germans also gave her the German citizenship, she did not think of herself as German or American or anything. No, she was a world citizen. And the world citizen for her meant that she was connected to every single individual on this planet, whom she considered as her equal, whether they have rights or have no rights. She felt connected with all of them because she shared with them a basic humanity that we will also discuss. At the same time, however, imagine that she thought that every single individual of this huge amount of millions and trillions of people that were unique, that every single human being was totally unique. And boy, did she demonstrate that in her own life. So that's we have to look at. So while she had a superb knowledge of Western philosophy, Kant, her favorite philosophers were Marx, Kant, Plato, Aristotle, Nietzsche, Augustine, Heidegger, of course, Thomas Aquinas. Although she notes, the kind of questions that she asks from these philosophers are totally unique and were not asked before. And that makes her original too. So she wasn't a Kantian, she wasn't a Marxist, she wasn't a Thomist, she just thinking for herself. And so when it comes to modernism, the 20th century, again, big confusion. On the one hand, you would think she was a modernist in terms of realizing the importance of social movements, of all the list of rights, including human rights that had emerged from the social, what they called the social movement, from Marx and for the labor movement and all of that. While she identified with that, she also sort of distanced herself from that by saying that that was not the place of rights. The only place of rights was the political community, not nature. For her, again, shockingly, there were no such thing as natural human rights. Rights originated in the political community, and that was the only area where you could find rights. So we have to really look more closely what's behind it. At the same time, politically speaking, she was really deep down in her heart in favor of direct democracy. She believed very highly in the town hall meetings preceding the American Revolution, and then had to adjust, obviously, to a much more complex picture of democracy. But she always maintained that these other notions of democracies always had an opening towards what she called the private realm, and were subject to influences of economical and other pressures, including that of course, of capitalism. So now, so far so good. Now we are approaching the major distinction of her entire work, and that is the distinction between vita activa and vita contemplativa. Where did she find those terms? If you look at her work, for instance, the human condition is totally organized under that distinction. If you look at her later work, when she started talking about the life of the mind, again, totally living under that particular distinction of vita activa and vita contemplativa. And she found that distinction. Guess who? In Augustine. St. Augustine uses that distinction for the first time in his work, The City of God, De Civitate Dei. He uses it in order to show that the Christian morality tended towards favoring the vita contemplativa because it allowed them to contemplate heavenly things, and there was a general disdain about the vita activa, and that triggered really in Hannah Arendt a kind of inner revolution. She wanted to give the vita activa, the active life, she wanted to give it back the dignity it deserves, and that's the plot of her major work. But the distinction between an active life and a contemplative life goes far back, much farther than even she was aware of. It goes as far back as the Indian Upanishad. And you find that this marvelous parable about two birds sitting on the same tree. One of the birds is picking the fruit like crazy, as we all know that only birds can pick. And on the other hand, there was the other bird, doesn't do a thing. She sits, and what does she do? She watches that other bird. Nothing else. Just watch. And that's the original meaning of contemplativa. To what? To sit back, to withdraw from the affairs of the world, the direct involvement, to withdraw and stop acting and start thinking. So as you follow this particular picture that was really discussed on end in Hinduism, as you follow it up, for Hannah, it was important that the next stop was Aristotle. And the Greek polis, the city-state, and its organization became something of a metaphor for Hannah Arendt, because Aristotle created the term bios politikos, the political life, associated with the display and the speeches within the polis. And it distinguishes bios politikos from bios in general. And the bios in general, Aristotle did not consider of having any reality, really, that you should even mention. It consisted of the household, it consisted of the slaves. Anything that was an instrument to maintain your life on this planet was looked upon by the Greeks with a particular era of contempt, because it made these activities, made them subject to the needs of nature. And what they wanted was to create a realm with free speeches where they could, independent of the necessities of life, talk about the glory of Greece, about the great deeds, particular individual action, about treason, about decisions regarding battle, and that was really their ideal. And for Hannah Arendt, I believe that became a kind of metaphor of moving into her own main work of the human condition. But before we land there, we have to go through Christianity. And in Christianity, the moral of Christianity was very clear that they favored the contemplative life. The Jesus, Hannah Arendt mentions Jesus, who had two female friends. One was Martha, and the other one was called Maria. Now, one evening, when Jesus was a guest at Martha's and Maria's, Martha did all the work, and it was sort of common at that time in their culture that the women did all the kitchen work and prepared everything. And the women would sit down somewhere and leisurely sip whatever they were sipping at that time and engage in talk and so on. Now, the curious thing is that while Martha was doing all the work, Maria was just sitting at the feet of Jesus and listening to his words. And Martha got really angry about that, and she came to Jesus and said, "Listen, do you know what's going on here? I mean, can't you tell this Maria, that my sister, that she should help me in the kitchen like all the other female folks here do?" And Jesus' answer is proverbial. You probably know Jesus' answer. Jesus' answer is, "Martha, Martha, you are worried about a lot of things. Mary has selected the better part." Whoa, what a downer for pure Martha. She only received one big defense in the Western canon, and that comes from Meister Eckhart, who finally restitutes the dignity of Martha and said she was the one that we should praise, not Mary, my sister. Now, that's very easy to sit at the feet of Jesus, but that was not really the official doctrine. The official doctrine of that episode between Jesus and the sisters carries over into the early patristic and the early Christian, how should I say, theology, and ends up, as we already saw, in Augustine, who considered the contemplative life the higher life because it allowed the priests and the clergy to live to some extent already in heaven in an anticipation of looking at heavenly things. We should not forget in that context that medieval age, I mean, only a few people, in other words, the clergy, knew Latin. And all these theological treatises were composed in Latin. The common people, the plebs, did not understand and had no access to this contemplative life. Again, you see an enormous split here between vita activa and vita contemplativa. So much so that the West had to wait until Dante and the Divina Commedia to finally have a work that was written not in Latin, and consciously so on the part of Dante, but written in the Italian dialect of that time, so that everyone, for the first time, had access to the elements of art and vita contemplativa. So now we are reaching the moment where we have to look at her major work. And it's called The Human Condition. Now, when she approaches that work, and she worked roughly 6 years on that work, when she approaches that work, there are 3 clusters of activities that she distinguishes. One is labor. The second one is what she calls work. And it's sort of interesting because now we think of labor as work, but she makes really a difference between labor and work. And then the third one is the one that really creates the basis for her overall philosophy, and that's called action. So we will go in a few movements through those three um, activities, and then come back very quickly to see how she applies those. So the first one is labor. Labor is the activities of human beings who have to earn a living just to stay alive. It doesn't distinguish them from animals because it's just a biological life, the maintenance of it. Huge amount of efforts are listed. Homo laborans, the human being that needs to work just to exist as a biological entity, a natural entity. And unfortunately, already at this level, Hannah Arendt realized that only a few make it. The devastation of hunger worldwide through history, huge, etc., for human beings who do not even have access to this first level of human activity, a level that even doesn't even distinguish them from animal life. And the second category of work is what she calls in Latin homo faber. That means now human beings separate themselves from nature and create things of their own. You can think of tool making at the beginning, but it's elaborate. Now what are created are human goods, consumer goods. Now this is now an area later called culture, where human beings fabricate what they want to live in and have a kind of a world of their own. And just now you begin to think, wow, it's interesting. Now we have the complete set, nature versus culture. As a natural human being, you are homo laborans. As a cultural human being, you are homo faber. You create things. And this should really be enough to characterize the human being. Like when I grew up, we had long discussion whether somebody was innate in human beings by nature or whether something was by culture, something that through education and whatnot had been created with a human being. But not for Hannah Arendt, because both homo laborans, the laborer, and the worker, the fabricator, both really are inferior, how should I say, stations of life that human beings that aspire towards what really defines them. And it is not labor, and it is not their work. What defines them are the political rights that they receive in the political community. And so before we can really go a little bit more into what that means, we should before we go into action, what she meant by action, we have to look briefly at the separation in her work between what is private and what is public. So what is private, what we consider now, today, what is most distinctly us, our families, our friends, the values we have, our life. For her, imagine that's a shock. It is only a shadowy existence. And she compares the existence to Plato's cave that we already studied. Insofar as you are a part of the circularity of lives or part of making your life comfortable and creating consumer goods that you can enjoy. In other words, what we call civilization for her, as civilization, had no great value. It was shadows upon shadows, etc. And so you would really have to go into what action was all about in order to understand it. So to live a private life in this sense without the public sphere means to be deprived of something of the highest value. Why? Because she thought that, especially in modern times, that many people, they consume and aspire towards consumption and a good life, and a few actually withdraw into themselves. And she thinks both types of people are really prisoners of their own wanting. They really never reach the independence that is needed for the freedom of political action. So the effect of the mass society on society nowadays is that we are all laborers in some fact, or job holders, and even the political activities that we might engage in is just a job. And so the danger of the private property, private world, private wealth moving into the sacrum in a sort of holy space for Hannah of legal rights was an intrusion that she wanted to prevent, but only partly could do. So now we have immediately switch around and say, well, what is public? If she considers all those elements that we consider dear to our heart as private and sort of inferior values because they don't make us who we really are, public is the ability to separate from nature and from your own culture and to create a space where you are part of a legal system. You are becoming a juridical person. The public sphere reveals what a person really is. And so we are already approaching one element of the question, who and what is Hannah Arendt? Well, the whatness is already there. The whatness is that the only life that really is of the highest value is the life in public. And the life in public means you appear before everybody, in principle, the entire world, etc., and make your case, and including what may happen within other members of the community, because all the members of that community are of equal status. So when you penetrate that public space that Hannah is talking about for the first time, you get, at least I did, for the first time an inkling what she means by freedom. What she means by freedom is something that is coterminous with action. Freedom is the possibility to set a new beginning, no matter what. No matter what your other concerns are or what the system is like, etc. Freedom is the ability to set a new beginning. And that then creates for her the notion of reality. And we have briefly to go into that notion, and then I make a pause to answer a few questions of yours, because it's important that I hear from you what you think about all of that. But so the definition of reality for Hannah Arendt, for how real is anything that appears in the world that we all share, and that can be seen and heard by everybody, even by ourselves, and it doesn't exclude anybody. Anybody has the right to do that, and that is the definition of reality. So when you want to feel real, she says, don't retrieve into your private world. That's not real. What is real is the public world, where you are recognized or not recognized, but you have a say in the political community and you commit yourself. So that presupposes plurality. And plurality, again, is not a bunch of people. Plurality for her is the entire human affairs world. It includes, in principle, everybody. Nobody is excluded. So you need to make yourself publicly count. And to the extent that you have rights, to that extent, you are real. So I think the real self is never private. It's always public. It's a mutual recognition and respect in the public. Only what is visible and public of me is the real self. And this is the second birth, which is all important. I make a little pause now because I think I have loaded it up quite a bit. So, any questions?
Thank you. I have a small question that I always wondered about Hannah Arendt. So maybe you can explain the fascination both for people, well, so simplified to the right and to the left for Hannah Arendt. So is there an ambivalence in her philosophy of freedom? Is there a freedom in her philosophy of the self that is beyond the political in a way, or sort of how would you explain the political sort of usage of Hannah Arendt in both camps?
Yeah, it's difficult to explain. Actually, it's a very good question. I see a connection there between that she never wanted to acknowledge anybody else as being influential for her thinking, because freedom is really unexpected. It creates within the political community the unexpected. She has long notions about Rosa Luxemburg, and when she talks about Marx, for instance, she has very laudatory remarks on the early Marx, let's say 1844. In her section on labor, she says, well, labor really doesn't make of you a truly human being, because labor keeps you in the natural state. But at the same time, she says, somebody who really pulled labor out of its anonymity and gave it an immense value is Karl Marx. And she makes reference, as we all know, to the manuscripts of 1844. And I personally have never read anything more beautiful about labor than reading those manuscripts. I mean, it's just incredible how he pulls this notion for which Hannah Arendt really has no sympathy, pulls it out of its anonymity and gives it a status of a dignity which is never reached, in my opinion. And that creates then the labor movement and all of that. Later on, she also has some critiques, obviously, of Marx, and we can discuss that a little later if we want. I mean, it has to do with that Marx was obviously a materialist, and later on they created the notion of dialectical materialism for his system, etc. But that, it's again, I mean, there are profound philosophical differences between the two, and that would be the subject of a course, an entire course. Anyway, I think I should press on because we have quite a bit more to do, and next I want to quickly go into our first work with you on the origin of totalitarianism. This is very early work, published in 1951. I mean, she practically came out of a stateless situation. She didn't belong to any state. And she took on Nazism and Stalinism. She took some flack in doing so because she practically treated them sort of together. And I think you can't do that. I mean, Nazism, very, very different from Stalinism. But for some reason, she was only interested in detecting some of the mechanisms of totalitarianism. The final state was always clear to her. The final state are the extermination and concentration camps of any kind of totalitarianism. And what they did is they went first, when you have a totalitarian regime, what they go first for is to take all the juridical rights away from you. That go first. They don't go first to, depriving you of your housing, etc. No, they want to make you a nobody in terms of rights. And she found something of a confirmation of her theory that she saw in all these movements, including the Western movement of totalitarianism. She has brilliant analysis, for instance, that after World War I, when the minorities were discussed, they were not taken care of. They created millions of homeless people right after World War I. And the reason for that was that they had not the tools really to think politically about rights. Or let's say the Christians and the Christian morality during the West. What they created was through, for instance, in the period of colonialism, they went again, took any kind of government that the local communities had, took that away from them, and created practically no man and people without an identity, so that they could exploit these particular reasons. They left them so. I mean, we all went through the aftermath of colonialization when the middle class, there was no middle class. And again, Hannah Arendt found a confirmation there that what they did really was a quasi-confirmation of her theory that what they really wanted was people without an identity. Or she shows in that work that what they first go for is destruction of the juridical person. Then they go and destroy your moral personality. Again, for instance, the anti-Semitism is in the West is systematic right from the beginning. All right, people, they have no juridical rights. They are housed in different ghettos in a variety of cities. The most horrible century, I mean, from my perspective, was the 14th century. But I mean, these are again studies that need to be sort of learned about individually. So anti-Semitism again sort of seemed to confirm this is systemic, and the people have no rights, and people have no rights. They are shoved around, and guess what? Again, the step is just a little step away to extermination. For the modern situation, the ultimate thing they can do is destroy your individual self, and this kind of anonymity and the refugees for Hannah Arendt were almost again something that the Western how should I say, the political structure couldn't take care of, couldn't deal with, because again they did not know where they should start to work, rather than herding them together in camps. And so, as my final document tonight is the Eichmann book. It's an incredible book, but it has a lot of, in my opinion, mistakes in it. First of all, so here is the Eichmann trial. I think you all know who Adolf Eichmann was. He was the really main organizer of the final solution of sending people to the camp, mostly to Auschwitz. A horror of an individual, and by Hannah Arendt volunteered to go to his trial in Jerusalem and observe the man, and then write an article for the New Yorker about it, and later on became out as a book. When the book came out, it created Hannah Arendt's perspective on Adolf Eichmann. In that perspective, he appeared as an empty bureaucrat and a person who couldn't even think, a person who was following orders, a person who had a mechanical application of even Kant's categorical imperative. It was a total inability to go beyond, his own defenses of doing just the job he was told to do, and that was his major defense, the job he did. She also, in the same work, attacked the Jewish Council's activity. The Jewish Council, for those of you who are not familiar with, these were small communities of Jews that were selected by Eichmann to work under him, to do some of the infrastructure work for him. And she had sort of negative words to say, Hannah Arendt did, about these Jews, of practically characterizing them as a potential collaborator with the Nazi. When the book came out, great scandal. Friends, she lost friends. She, while she was teaching at the School of Social Research, she was asked to drop her courses. The school wanted to drop her. Major friends like Hans Jonas and many intellectuals left her. She was asked to change something of her perspective. She did. It sheds some light about who she is. And we will that develop also in further, maybe next week. But for the time being, I detected a mechanism here that sheds some light of what's going on here. Why she could interpret the workings, and even the so-called character of Eichmann as a kind of empty bureaucrat and a robot and nothing else. And that has to do with that the method that we employ to analyze something allows us only certain objects to appear. In other words, I repeat, the method that you and I use to detect something, etc., sets the conditions, what we see and what we can't see. Example, if I'm a materialist and I'm presented with the notion that the soul is a mental substance, there is no way that I could ever find mental substance anywhere. Why? They're excluded by my very methodology. It's just as simple as that. And I think what meant by what Hannah Arendt rejected was psychoanalysis. She rejected empathy. She rejected going study historical details. She rejected what we now normally call journalism. Imagine that. Why? If journalism were involved here, they would have gone after the previous life of Adolf Eichmann, how he behaved at home, where the leads went, etc. And guess what? They actually did that. And totally different notion of who Adolf Eichmann was emerged. But this was a different methodology. This was a methodology where empathy counted, where it counted. They went into some of the Jewish councils and they realized the agony of those Jews who had to maintain a semblance of order in the under Eichmann, to even rescue the modicum of rights that the Jews still had before they were deported. You cannot imagine. I read a few books, maybe you have too, where you realize what agony that was. Now, switching back to Hannah Arendt, she had no inkling of that because she had rejected empathy. She had rejected going after psychological or psychoanalysis. Now, there are ways of, there are psychiatrists on both sides, imagine, that create a sort of perspectivism on what's going on. For me, what was important to understand Hannah Arendt's perspective here is her methodology allowed both a new perspective to emerge that nobody else even contemplated. And that is exactly what she thinks of action. Action is the freedom you acquire in the public space to start a new beginning, be the revolution, being whatever comes to mind, being talking, for instance, she has a lot to say about the French Revolution, Robespierre. She loves Robespierre again. I mean, again, it's sort of very difficult to understand, but it's definitely at the heart of what action means for Hannah Arendt, that it means to set the capability to separate yourself so much from what is accepted as the given reality and on your own ground, out of your own reality, so to speak, creativity, to set a new beginning. And so the value of Eichmann, the book, is to have created a perspective that was not previously mentioned by anybody. And now it has profound consequences in many of these so-called right people, etc. You realize that they are, to some extent, very common, childish people. I mean, I do not want to go into detail to name a few, but you can put in the rest, etc. That they may be sick, they may be all sorts of things, but she opened up a perspective on evil, political evil, that nobody have been paying attention to. Not that the Holocaust is banal. Nothing, no evil is banal. No, that's not. But the people who deal in dispensing evils, they can be in many ways banal. That is the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt seemed to detect. Now, again, I want to emphasize, this is perspective, and it is totally in conformity with her notion of action, about which we will hear a little bit more next time. But on the other hand, the perspective that evolves through people who psychoanalyzed him, it went into his early childhood drawing, went into the kind of associations he had, went into all the tricks and defensive games he played before he even reached the status within the Bundeswehr of the incredible deportation occurrence, etc. And the perspective that emerges there is, frankly, Eichmann was a monster. There's no other word for it. He was a monster. He dealt with radical evil. And to some extent, he had built up defenses that were so strong, it couldn't be broken, not even by an observing spirit by Hannah Arendt, who just looked and analyzed him on the outward behavior that he exhibited during the trial. So I'm reaching the end of our little philosophical discussion today, but I want to hold both of these perspectives up for your contemplative eye, because that's what we are doing here. We try to think. And you see those two perspectives. Who is right? So again, it would be hard to say. I force the issue a little bit, but the topic at hand is too serious to not take it very, very serious. How you come out of this in your evaluation. The New Yorker had something very interesting to say at the end of all of this. The New Yorker said that this controversy between Hannah Arendt and the people who considered Eichmann a monster accidentally became a masterpiece of the real darkness of the Holocaust that cannot be assimilated neither by one perspective nor by the other. For me, it was more important as I got to know Hannah Arendt about the limitation of her outlook, but also her justification, and about the other perspective of to see behind the scenes through the tools that we have at hand, empathy and investigation, psychiatry, and all of these things, to see those two perspectives emerge and let them stand there, because between you and me, no perspective could give an account of the horrible thing that happened. So I want to close here and see, we have about 4 or 5 minutes left. How did you take that in about the Eichmann stuff?
Well, I would like to ask a different question, sort of about the book about totalitarianism, which maybe relates to the Eichmann question as well. I mean, just frankly, when you think of her, maybe it's connected. So there's been a lot of criticism, I guess, also about her Eichmann reportage in some way, how it's framed and how it's sort of written. But the more ambivalent, I think, is the theory of totalitarianism that was born in the Cold War and quite somehow directly led until today to a misunderstanding about how totalitarianism works, one could argue. Both somehow obscuring the mechanisms of Nazi Germany and sort of building an equivalence with Stalinism that's historically just not tenable.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I mean, they are such different realities, horrible realities, both of them, but so different. You wonder how you can bring them both on any kind of denominator, actually. And yet she did that. And the questions that I was faced with, and you maybe have the better answer than I do, I just thought she was so, how should I formulate that, so taken by the importance of rights and the place where rights originated, that there and where they ended up. If you don't should I say, care very, very methodically for the political public space, then you slide into totalitarian practices that get you further away from leading a life that has any value. So I'm tempted to say the only reason why she could, to some extent wrongly, even characterize some of what was going on in Nazism, right about that, was her then obsession, I think, with modernity and counter-modernity. This is why it is difficult to even classify her as modern or anti-modern. I mean, in many ways, I think you would look at her as a reactionary. At least.
Yeah, I was going to say, so it's all Heidegger's fault again.
Yeah, right. But I mean, it is curious that even when Heidegger was 80, that she didn't really come out and say what she really thought about the guy. But I tend to think that the mixture that she found herself in between modernism and reactionary anti-modernism is part of that mystery of that woman. I mean, on the one hand, she was very, very grateful to the social movements. She was grateful to Marx. She was grateful to the left. She was grateful to the abolishing of the terms minority and majority, the potential of the labor movement. All of that very grateful. At the same time, she was so worried about that empirical factors like the economic factors, capitalism and all of that. So it would influence actually the correct place. She calls it a place of where rights needed to be located, and where. So that's sort of my tendency. But as you know, that goes on and on and on. That modernity, reactionary. She stands. Again, she cannot be identified easily. She has a lot to bear, and a lot of insight. But
Eugen, I have another question. First of all, thank you. It's really a privilege listening to you. It's very inspiring.
Yeah.
Let's imagine Hannah Arendt would have lived over the last 3 or 4 months, and she would have been the key advisor to the German Chancellor. What would have been her advice from your point of view to handle the whole situation?
Oh my! I think her advice would have been to argue her cause. I mean, to argue in public among equals. I mean, I take the Länder, the Bundesländer, to be the political community you're talking about here, me. And while all these minister presidents tended to go into their own direction, she would have argued to set a new beginning here. And she would have been capable of formulating it. Now, she was perhaps too much already interested in consensus and the kind of consensus debates that go on with a classic definition of politics as the art of making compromises, etc. In order to be that almost univocal voice that would set, here, Truman, President Truman, here the buck stops, right here. So that I would see that she would say that, etc. But again, I mean, she's caught up like we are, and more so that the private, what he called the private realm, and I only had a little time of alluding to the private realm, has more and more influence on what's going on politically, and that is really a disservice you can do to the level of rights, etc. All of a sudden, the man with the most money can define, I don't need to go any further, can define what is right and what is wrong. And so, to some extent, there are articles after articles where she comes out as a kind of prophet of our modern situation. But what really is at her heart, I see, and you will see next time when I go into what she calls natality, her heart is with every human being on this planet. And so, anyway, I thank you for coming. I thank you for enjoying. I enjoy these talks a lot. And
as we do.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that echo. And we will continue. In a week, I'll have some more to say about that. Thanks.
Thank you. Have a great.
Yeah, have a good night. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.